Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation. My name is John. I am the tattooed historian, and it's so great to be back on once again with my great friend, the cheese to my cracker, Pete Carmichael, director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. Pete, how are you, my friend?
John, you outdid yourself, and of course, as we've already told Lindsay, this is our last show for the summer, which we had intended, of course, to call it quits at the end of June. And how long were you working up this intro, or it just comes naturally to you?
I grew up on Don Rickles, so Don Rickles and British comedy. So It's like I have this dry, weird humor. So yeah, it was either that or the Abbott to my Costello. So, yeah.
I like that one as well.
Okay,
I like that.
I'll use that for next time.
Yeah. What about Benny Hill? Did you like Benny Hill growing up?
Oh, I love Benny Hill. Yeah, Benny Hill was great. Yeah.
I showed my girls a little bit of Monty Python.
Oh yeah.
It didn't land at all.
Didn't?
They left about 10 minutes. They missed that great scene where King Arthur comes up to the knight King Arthur cuts off his arm, right? Off all of his arms and his legs, and continues to try to resist. They missed that. I think they would have pivoted. The girls would have, but they just stayed to see that scene.
Yeah, maybe. We'll never know.
That's right. Well, Lindsey Privet is our last guest. Again, for the summer, John and I will come back when the semester resumes, which is going to resume for me in August. And I'm thrilled to have Lindsay on the show, one, because of her scholarship, but also because of her background. Lindsay and I had a conversation, I think maybe into May, I believe, and we talked about a range of things to discover that Lindsay, like myself, that we got our start in the National Park Service. Lindsay probably won't be surprised where, at Vicksburg, where she was a summer seasonal. And how many summers were you at Vicksburg?
I think I did about 7.
Wow.
So 7 or 8. There's quite a few. Yeah.
Yeah. I did about that many as well at 3 different Virginia parks. And Lindsay and I talked about all the joys and challenges of public history, and we're certainly going to get to that in just a moment. I'm going to tell our audiences a little bit more about Lindsay. Lindsay's undergraduate degree is from Baylor University, where she studied under Michael Parrish. Michael Parrish is the series editor for the LSU Civil War series. What is it? I should know that off the top of my head. Divided Conflicts. Oh my God, that's embarrassing. Is that right?
I think so.
Right. So she worked with Michael Parrish at Baylor. Did U.S. history. Did you do public history there as well at Baylor?
Just U.S.
Just straight up history, old-fashioned history. Okay.
Old-fashioned history. I went with the intention of doing museum studies, but decided to just cast my lot with history.
All right. And then from there, Lindsay ventured off to the University of Alabama, where she worked with George Rabel, who's one of my favorite historians. George Rabel has done books on a wide variety of topics. His first book to be on violence and Reconstruction. His most recent book, well, he did a series of lectures for LSU. I don't know the title off the top of my head, but it's an interesting book on how Southerners imagined the Yankee race. It's the Fleming lectures that George gave there. That's an excellent book. But Rabel also did a fantastic book on Fredericksburg, Confederate Republic, on Confederate women at war, and rumor has it that he's working on George B. McClellan. Rabel he plays it pretty close to the vest, so I think that's what it is, but I'm not exactly sure. And so from the University of Alabama, Lindsay has gone on to Anderson University in South Carolina, close to Spartanburg. I can't remember now.
Yeah, we're about Spartanburg's on the other side of Greenville, so maybe hour and a half.
Oh, okay, all right. So it's upcountry South Carolina.
Yeah,
that's a better description, I think.
Yeah.
And there, Lindsay teaches again a range of courses: U.S. history, Gilded Age, Civil War, and a little bit of public history. You teach as well.
I do some public history. I have a class on memory and how memory has been shaped. And that's, I think, proving to be one that students really enjoy, especially given our current climate that we're in.
Yeah. They'll be coming in mass, hopefully this semester for that class. So, Lindsay, because you're talking to two historians, we do our homework, research, background check, if you want to call it.
True.
And John, I've got some really good fun facts. Are you ready for the first fun fact, John?
I'm always ready for fun facts.
Let's do it. All right. Lindsay has visited every single state in the Union. All 50.
Wow.
She's done it. Now, I'll ask, but I already know the answer, Lindsay. Your favorite state in the Union, it has to be. There can be no other than the Hoosier State, the great state of Indiana. We got the flatlands up north. We got the hills down south.
Yeah.
You got whatever you want. You got the Indy 500. What is there not to like? That's my guess. John, what do you think is Lindsay's favorite state that she's visited?
I would hope it's Pennsylvania, but we have whoopie pies. We have all kinds of great Revolutionary War and Civil War history. I would hope it would be Pennsylvania, but
Philly cheesesteaks.
Pardon? Yes. Well, yes, Philly cheesesteaks. We have the Manny brothers in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, but the problem is in Pennsylvania, you got to either cheer for the Eagles or for the Steelers, and that's just not palatable at all.
Well, it's not palatable for me either, but I'm still here for right now.
All right, Lindsay, here's a big drum roll. Tell us, of all the 50 states you have visited, what's your favorite one?
Oh, goodness. I don't even know. They're all so different and wonderful.
No.
I
I
will tell you that the surprise, one of my favorites that I don't think I would have anticipated when we visited was Idaho. Is a beautiful, beautiful state. We took a driving vacation up next to, I think it's the Salmon River, going up to Big Hole National Battlefield, and it's stunning. And that's one, when you think of beautiful states, Idaho is not the first one that comes to mind. So
potatoes. That's what you think.
Right.
You think potato? That's exactly what you think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so Idaho it is. And I should also note again, as part of our background check, Lindsay, I would say, introduction to historical sites was with her father, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm just, curious. Now we're going to go Civil War. Your first Civil War site with Dad, and what stood out?
So I don't know if it's the first one. So I grew up in Vicksburg. So I grew up all over that park. But one of the very strongest memories I have when I was a child, we would take these themed road trip vacations and link battlefields together. And I remember very clearly being probably about 8 years old, and we were at Manassas, and my dad and I were walking up this hill in the middle of the July, around the time the battle would have happened. And I remember him turning to me and looking at me and being like, can you imagine trying to charge up this hill with a full wool uniform, carrying a rifle with people shooting at you? And for an 8-year-old, it's one of those memories that just makes you realize where you are and where you're standing, right? Yeah.
When, that moment in your youth when your imagination is grabbed by a place.
Yes.
When your imagination, it sort of just it's so connected to that landscape, and before you know it, it's got a hold of it. And like for you at Manassas as well. Mm-hmm. Let's stay on the public history angle here for just a little bit more, and then John and I will talk about your dissertation that you are now, of course, working into a full book manuscript. Your time at Vicksburg. Could you tell us a little bit about how that has shaped your thinking about being a teacher as well as a scholar?
Yeah, so Vicksburg, I started my first season at Vicksburg was the summer after I graduated high school. And I very much started as the person who ran the desk and explained to people where the bathrooms were. Yeah. That's how I got my start. But from there, I eventually graduated into being able to give battlefield talks, to walking the battlefield and riding through the battlefield and being able to do research. And by the end of my time, I was actually doing, I was their education technician. So I was running all of their junior ranger summer camps and things like that. And it's really interesting because when I teach my general education students, my freshmen and sophomores who just have to take US1 and US2, I see a lot of those visitors in them, right? And so I noticed that for a lot of those kind of entry-level classes, I tend to fall back on a lot of those storytelling techniques and those techniques that you use to kind of try to help people make connections with items or people or events of the past. So it was probably a semester or two in before I realized that I was pulling from that public history background in the classroom, and seeing students kind of become engaged in similar ways.
Lindsay, I was at Fredericksburg National Park 2 weeks ago to be part of a workshop about interpreting issues of race in light of what had happened in the last 2.5 weeks after the murder of George Floyd. And one of the issues that we discussed, an issue that, as you well know, that we're all deeply interested in or concerned about, and that is, how do we bring a more diverse audience to our Civil War battlefields? And I'm curious, being in Vicksburg, in which I believe I'm correct in saying that the local population I don't know if it's mostly African American, but there's significant numbers of African Americans, like Petersburg, Virginia. I mean, all around the national park in Petersburg is largely African American. So you've got a large Black population in Vicksburg. What did you see over time there as to how the population, local population, interacted or engaged or was a part of what you all did at Vicksburg?
I agree. At the time that I left, the diversity question was still something that they were kind of trying to struggle with and grapple with people who were kind of coming to the park and visiting the park. I know with our junior ranger camp, we were begin initiatives of trying to bring in local community organizations to kind of have kids come in to get to participate during the day. The camp ran Monday through Friday from, I think, 8 a.m. till noon. And it was, of course, National Park Service. It was completely free. We just needed to be able to help access children. So a lot of the work that I saw specifically was going out into the community, and my computer just wanted to do an update, so I had to make sure that I didn't hit the wrong button there for a second. To go out into the community, to go out into elementary schools, and to meet individuals where they were, and where they were at, and to tell some of these stories.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Lindsay, I think that what you experienced and saw at Vicksburg, John and I could give you many other examples of similar efforts. Again, I'm not trying to suggest that there can't be more should be done on that front. Mm-hmm. I think this is a time more than ever that we need to acknowledge and to some degree embrace the good work that many of your former colleagues at Vicksburg are continuing to do. I mentioned Sanders here at Gettysburg and what she has done, and the list goes on and on. So it's my hope that, on these, again, I spent a little bit too much time on Twitter this week. And so if I look a little haggard tonight, it is because of that. Because one of the things I'm just sort of struck by is that I don't understand why there isn't more on Twitter that is more celebratory and more positive and reaffirming. And I think that these are the kinds of things that you just described, Lindsay, is what should be out there, that people should, at the day of these acknowledge, so that we have a good sense of where we are. Instead of just sort of knocking things down that we're not doing this, we've never done this, which is just simply not true. So it's good to hear that Vicksburg is working hard on that front to diversify their audience. John, did you have any public history questions before we slide over to Lindsay's book? I'm going to call it a book now, Lindsay, if that's okay. Where's your book? It's not your dissertation anymore, right?
It is my book.
It is your book. All right, that's good. So before we do your book, John, did you have anything to ask about public history before we go?
Yeah, Lindsay, I would like to know, for those who are watching and in the comment section and such, who are thinking of diving into public history as far as going and trying to get a summer, maybe at a National Park Service, or to at least understand what they need to do to get involved in helping to change this, either a demographic shift or accessibility issues, etc. If there are students watching out there, or even some of your students who may come to you and say, I would like to get involved in public history, what would you tell those students to do?
Yeah, so and I even have students who are becoming really interested, when we have this question of what do we do with history, and public history is a really great option for that. And one of the things I direct them to is making themselves familiar with the sites of public history that are in their hometown, local museums, if they happen to live anywhere near archives, things like that, or tour homes. We have several tour homes here in the area, historical societies, things like that, that they could either have the opportunity, if not to get their feet wet in interning or working there, or simply volunteering, because many of these places are desperately in need of docents and people to just sometimes help keep the doors open. And one of the things that I found that when I was at Vicksburg, just finding out about all the different jobs people were doing while I was there and asking if they minded if I helped. And it just blew open the opportunities of figuring out what I like to do, what wasn't really my thing, and then the ability to put on my resume, like, I helped catalog artifacts with the museum curator or something along those lines. So I think that kind of getting your foot in and just kind of figuring out the lay of the land. And I don't think that there are many people who are much nicer than public historians to just say, like, how I want your job. How do I become? How do I do this? There's tons of people who are willing to help and give advice and kind of tell their story to kind of help people figure out how to do that.
And I think that's very important to acknowledge that sometimes all you have to do is just ask. And sometimes a lot of historians are introverts and they don't know how to ask. And sometimes you just have to be ready to hear no and hope for a yes, that you can help out. And I think that's one of the major roadblocks I see with a lot of students that I have come into contact with. They just don't know that you can just ask. Ask someone needs help with this or whatever. So yeah, I think that's very, very important to breaking down that barrier.
All right. So we'll talk about Lindsay, the scholar, since she has not, here it is, it's worth noting, not left the public history experiences behind you. One more example of where the fields of public history and academic history have come together. You're, again, a very good example of that. And now we'll focus on your scholarship. The title, the working title, how if we say that? The working title of your book is Fighting Johnnies, Fevers, and Mosquitoes, a medical history of the Vicksburg Campaign. Before we sort of drill down into Vicksburg, I'd like for you to just reflect upon what does it mean to bring an angle toward a military campaign that is accounts for the medical history of it, right? Why does medicine matter when we study military history? That's what I'm trying to do.
Well, so I think one of the things that's so very interesting, and this was something I think John and I were talking about before we got started, is we're keenly aware of the victims of the war. We're keenly aware of the casualty lists, of the death and the dying and these processes, and what it takes to put men back together and to heal them. But we don't tend to focus on the importance of that. And what I mean by that is, if you're sending men into battle, you theoretically need to have enough of them coming out of that battle to do it again the next day, right? And you need to be able to continuously keep an army that has enough strength and fighting effectiveness in order to be able to wage the war. And if you can't do that, then the army's not going to be successful. You're going to lose the war. And the bulk of how you are going to do that is going to be, at least in part, rooted in the health of soldiers, in the medical care that they're receiving, and in the knowledge of the officers in the medical corps whose responsibility it is to take care of these issues. So it's kind of that silent specter that's always there. These men are always laboring in the background. Anytime we talk about an army moving from this location to that location, or participating in 3 days of battle at Gettysburg, but we rarely ever take a moment and focus on that process of what it takes to keep an army healthy and operational.
Right. Is it one reason why we've not given sufficient attention to the health of the rank and file of the soldiers is that in the battle reports and the soldier letters, could you talk to us about that written evidence that we as historians have relied so heavily upon to reconstruct campaign histories or battle narratives? I think that one of the things that comes out in your book is that the sources themselves, from the soldiers and from the officers, that they don't really tell the whole story. Right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what could you say to us about those sources? What don't they say often? That and then where did you get the medical history from? I guess is where.
Yeah. So I think one of the reasons why this hasn't been a main focus has been because I think we have a tendency to feel like we've known what the medical history of the war is, right? It's a bunch of sawbones who are like waiting at a tent, ready to like chop off people's legs and put them in piles. And that was kind of the narrative of what medicine was. And it just kind of swept through and has kind of really remained unchallenged until the past, couple of decades. And a lot of that kind of memory of medicine, a lot of that legacy is rooted in soldier letters. So when authors would go to write about, or historians would go to write about a campaign history or soldiers' experiences in the field, they usually always included medical care and death and dying, but they're using soldiers' letters to talk about those things. And soldiers have a very specific perception of what's happening to them. They have a very kind of almost a bitterness at times of the way that the army has control over their bodies, has authority over their bodies, is utilizing their bodies, and has kind of taken that power away from them, that freedom that they're used to. And surgeons are just another example of that. Surgeons have the ability to decide if you're sick enough to sit out for the day, or if you're malingering and you have to go on night watch that night. Or they have the ability to decide if your leg is bad enough to come off and they're going to start dismantling your body, or if it's okay enough that you'll make it. Like, there's a lot of power that a surgeon has over a soldier's body. And that's a very unsettling feeling. I think even today, when we're sick, when we go to the hospital and we're interacting with doctors and physicians, the feeling that they have the ability to make decisions, they have knowledge of our bodies that we don't have, we don't understand. It's a very kind of frightening thing to kind of navigate. So when soldiers write about the aftermath of their care, a lot of times they lay blame at the feet of surgeons who are engaged in these different professional kind of discourses about proper medical care, how you triage patients on the field, how you make those hard decisions about who you're going to treat next and who you're going to leave there to let die. Soldiers have a very specific perception that doesn't kind of engage everything else that's going on in that moment.
Right. Yeah, I think it's, and that's well said, that the soldiers' resentment toward the military establishment as a whole, they all channel it or target at a surgeon who is not responsible for their entrapment. Although, as you also again point out, the immense power that a surgeon had. And I recall in Lee's army that he came to understand that too many surgeons had personal relationships with the soldiers that had existed prior to the war. And so, and I don't remember when this policy was enacted, but it made it mandatory that Confederate doctors would have to be rotated from various hospitals so that that kind of personal relationship or favoritism would not result in either keeping a man in the hospital for too long or sending them home. But I think, again, it's an excellent point for everyone to remember that the stereotype of the drunken butcher as the typical Civil War surgeon, it's a lot of hostility.
Yeah.
One men who understandably felt that the system was rigged against them. And I think, you can understand where that anger came from.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that gets lost in that narrative, though, is what surgeons themselves then endure. Because in seeing that story from the perspective of the soldier, we lose the surgeon's perspective of laboring among thousands of men who have been dismembered and mutilated, trying to make what decisions they could in the moment with limited help, limited access, sometimes after the sun has gone down under candlelight. The stereotype of that drunken butcher makes you pause and wonder, those of them who exhibited that behavior, why were they drunk, right? What did they experience themselves? Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that we really don't think about, is kind of like the trauma that these surgeons went through, just as much as not just as much, because the bodies are being destroyed, but the men that are wounded, the surgeons are going through mental trauma as well, because some of these surgeons never even seen a gunshot before they were put on the field and put into service. I think it's really important, Lindsay, for you to point out too that how different your future book is, as far as the fact that we've had previous works about surgeons who are kind of in an area where it was contained. It wasn't a field hospital per se. It wasn't in the in a place where there were shortages a lot. There are instances where we see monographs and books where they are in hospitals and they're doing anatomical studies in hospital environments, not in field hospital environments. Your work goes into what the conditions are like on the ground, as we would say, right in the heart of everything. Can you go into how your book will fit, your future book will fit into that kind of a narrative?
Yeah. So one of the things I envision is and I think the work that you're referencing is Shauna Devine's Learning from or she's the most notable one, Shauna Devine's Learning from the Wounded, which is an amazing book that does look at surgeons and physicians who are using the Civil War as an opportunity to expand their medical knowledge in the middle of the 19th century. And one of the things that I find really interesting is they're getting all of these specimens, they're getting autopsy reports from surgeons who are working in general hospitals, and they're collecting it all in DC for the intention of building the National Library of Health and Medicine, or what ends up becoming that. And so you have this like higher set of surgeons who are operating in general hospitals and who are engaged in these kind of like professional conversations. But for them to be able to do what they're doing, they also need to have conversations with the surgeons who are in the field dealing with men who as they come off of the field. And I'll give you an example of this. The Battle of Chickasaw Bayou in December of 1862. It's Grant's essentially his first effort to try to take Vicksburg. Fails miserably, but it is one of the first battles that is fought in the Western Hemisphere right after a handful of different reforms in terms of collecting and transporting and evacuating soldiers from the field have gone into place. It takes place about 2 days after 3 days after Fredericksburg. And there is a man named Edmund Andrews who takes all of the records and says in the beginning that this is the first time a surgeon's been able to do this, because until now it's been too chaotic. You have a man on the field, you put him on a train and a wagon, and off he goes, and you never hear about him anymore. But he takes all of the records for all of the cases in his division, and he follows them and manages to figure out what happens to them up to 20 or 30 days out from receiving their wounds, so that he could then trace the decisions that happened on the battlefield. What were the results? Who had secondary hemorrhages? Who had to have a secondary amputation? Who died? And collate kind of all of that data. And he was one of the field surgeons that does this. He's not one of the guys who's operating in a giant general hospital. So it's that level of communication between the field and these higher hospitals that make it that kind of makes the whole picture complete.
Yeah, I want to before I get to Pete real quick, I'll let Pete take over then. Shout out to Shauna Devine, because Pete is at the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry at Western University, where I will be going. So I'm sure we'll be able to possibly run into each other at some point along the way. And that book is from the UNC Press.
UNC Press, right. And it won the Watson Brown Prize as well, the distinguished one.
Yes. And it's pinned in the comments if anyone's interested in that as well.
Yeah. So could you talk to us a little bit about actually what did surgeons learn, and from Vicksburg or from another campaign that you might be familiar with, Lindsay? Because what you're talking about or what you're describing is the professionalization of the American military establishment, and they learn it, as you've just said, from broken bodies and also from the dead. This is one of the photographs. I think it'll be fine to see from Sean's book.
Oh yes,
right. And so these sort of living specimens, right? And I assume that. Well, I think almost for a fact that these physicians were focused almost entirely on their physical bodies. I don't recall that they're asking about how these men were coping with the emotional fallout or what we would say emotional trauma. So could you tell us, what are these doctors learning, and how does this help the medical establishment become more professional?
I think that's one of the struggles with doing Civil War medicine. And one of the reasons why not much more has been done, with the exception of the past several decades, is because the standard narrative is that they don't learn anything. Like, there's no massive medical advancements the way you get when you come out of World War I, for example, when they figure out how to perform blood transfusions in the field, or the cosmetic and the reconstructive surgery advancements that kind of come out of that. There's a handful of surgeons who who experiment with antiseptics and who are kind of on the verge of figuring out how infection is being transmitted through hospitals and how to sterilize and keep soldiers clean. But one of the things is that ends up happening toward the end of the war, right? So it would have been different if it happened in 1861 and then you have four or 5 years to kind of perfect what's going on. I think the biggest skill that they come out of learning the war with is learning just simply how to do these things while they're in the field, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So how to collect bodies for autopsy, how to collect these autopsy reports, how to codify these informations, creating a place to keep all of this information and for it to be able to be built upon, and these specimens that they collect and things like that. And in terms of field care in the Army, I think one of the greatest advancements that they figure out is how to have the Army and the Medical Corps kind of coexist and help one another as they're trying to undertake things like campaigns, these massive kind of movement of men. So it's kind of that bureaucratized sense.
Yeah. Could you give some example of where you see the collaboration between a medical establishment that has now become incorporated into the military establishment and that they are working side by side?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things, and this is one of the things that's great about studying Vicksburg, because it comes right on the cusp of some of these changes. I'll give Shiloh as an example. I think most people, when they think of medical disasters, they think of Manassas, First Manassas, where evacuation just breaks down on the field. Men are left in the sun for days. There are people with injuries who are like forced to walk back to DC, and it just becomes an overall kind of disaster. Something similar-ish kind of happens at Shiloh. Not to the same extent, but as the Union Army is kind of like being pushed up against Pittsburgh Landing, state governors send ships to go and get their men, because the assumption is that they need to evacuate everyone immediately. The medical corps, the medical care, the Army's not going to take care of these men the way that they would at home. So you have the Sanitary Commission, these state governors, you have all of these ships that kind of line up, and they put men on them and just take them away. And Sherman writes a letter a couple of months after Shiloh, I think to his brother, and says that there were some 57,000 men that were gone and not accounted for.
Good God.
Wow.
And he's 2 months after the war, he's like, there's still 2,000 men. We have no idea where they are. And that's kind of this moment of, if we cannot figure out, one, how to care for the men in the field, but also how to keep these civilian organizations out of that, we're not going to be, this isn't sustainable. We can't have 57,000 men just disappearing, and they're only 2 years into the war. So a lot of what we begin to see in 1862 going into 1863 are reforms that strengthen the power of the medical corps. So one of the things that the new Surgeon General in the spring of 1862 does, William Hammond, is that he separates the medical corps from their supply base from the quartermasters. Previously, a medical officer, if he wanted an ambulance, a wagon, a boat, he'd have to go to the quartermaster. But medical officers, and most people don't realize this at the time, medical officers have a rank, but at the time they don't have any authority in the military command. So their orders don't carry any weight. So the quartermaster goes, yeah, when I get to it. Right. Meanwhile, you have shortages in medicine. You can't transport men from point A to point B because that's not what's being privileged. When Hammond separates them, he creates the purveyor and the storekeeper positions within the medical department itself that gives medical directors the complete authority over all of their instruments, all of their transportation, everything kind of like that. And I think what you begin to see is kind of a mutual cooperation then that emerges between the medical directors and these high military command. One of the things that kind of comes out in my book is that military command is still not obligated to follow the orders of medical directors or surgeons, and if their recommendations don't fit in line with what the objective is, they'll willingly throw it out. But more often than not, you see this kind of mutual cooperation between the two that kind of manages to get these campaigns kind of moving.
And then before I turn over back to John, do you find any examples during the Vicksburg campaign in which officers turned to surgeons, turned to doctors and said, I'd like your recommendation or I'd like your advice regarding either the health of the troops or advice about the environment in which the Army was inhabiting? Did you find any examples like that, or are they pretty separate? And if it is, why is that? Why? Because today you wouldn't think, you wouldn't hesitate to turn to medical professionals and seek their advice. Oh, maybe these days you actually would. I've overspoken here. We have had some examples of where medical professionals are sort of discounted. But back in the Civil War, do you have any examples at all of that?
So from what I've seen, the medical establishment or the medical corps tends to be more reactionary. So instead of kind of that preemptive, this is our command, let's figure out how to do it and keep everyone healthy, they'll go ahead and they'll make their decisions, and they do it in the middle of June. It's hot, it's humid, men start falling out. That's when the surgeon tries to get a hold of somebody and be like, I think we need to stop. I think people need a rest. I think, and usually sometimes depending on what's going on, it's in those moments that they're like, nope, we got to go. We have to be here at this time. We're moving. You need to figure out how to get everyone to our objective.
So I never realized until this conversation that the John Wayne movie, The Horse Soldiers, actually could have happened with his argument between him and his medical surgeon that came along for the ride, literally. That's pretty amazing that there's this butting heads, and I didn't realize that the surgeons held rank, but really didn't hold rank. They didn't hold the power, that they needed. That's an amazing thing to think about, because that would cause all kinds of mayhem. It had to. We have a question in the comment section I'd like to bring up from Andrea. She said those soldiers who were from Shiloh, are they considered like absent without leave, as we'd say today? How are they classified? Are they just missing, like Sherman wrote?
I think at the time, Sherman considered them to be AWOL. Sherman considered them to be deserters. And I think that would have been that the classification. I think he actually, I'm trying to remember the term he uses. I think absent without permission or something along those lines. But desertion is so kind of amorphous kind of at the time as these men kind of disappear and wander their way back and things like that, it doesn't, I haven't seen necessarily a lot of fallout as these men begin to they track them down and these men begin to kind of trickle back in to the ranks.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
Oh, I was going to ask, Lindsay, do you think that another issue concerning, especially in the Vicksburg campaign and summer of spring of 1863, going into the summer of 1863, how do you see the lack of just not only power in the surgeon's hands, but also just the lack of surgeons and medical personnel that's going on at that time? How does that impact, the strength of the armies in that period?
Yeah, so it seems to hurt them much more that winter. So from January to about April, Grant is on the Louisiana side of the river desperately trying to dig a canal so he doesn't have to deal with Vicksburg.
Right.
And that is where everything just falls apart. To the point where the medical department actually sends people to come down and inspect the operations, because rumor has it that people are dying, men are dying, by the thousands.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you get a lot of people who are talking about the shortage of surgeons. When they make their campaign, and this is one of the remarkable things I think about the campaign itself, is that men's health actually improve. The Union Army's health improves when they cross the Mississippi River as they're fighting their way to Vicksburg. For a handful of different reasons, but men are kind of given more flexibility to kind of just care for themselves while they're in the field. And so there's a lot less even material where people are talking about certainly their surgeons are there. They're trying to kind of take care of the men who do get sick. But you notice the shortage of surgeons a lot less than they do when they're marching. And then, of course, at the time of the siege for the Union Army, you have a bit of a shortage during the siege, but Grant has reconnected to his supply base at the river, and he's able to send men to Milliken's Bend. And so he has a stable, established medical place away from the fighting that kind of then has direct location to hospitals in St. Louis and Memphis. Things are much, much different for the Confederates, of course. So they struggle from the get-go, and they really fall victim in the midst of the siege between this squabbling between surgeons and officers, where they're fighting over space, they're fighting over cooking instruments, they're fighting over who gets to go to the hospital and who doesn't get to go to the hospital, all sorts of different things.
So would you attribute Grant's success at Vicksburg that's what I'll give you. It's a multiple choice, right? So you got to pick one. You're going to be one. I know what you're going to try to do. It's just like with the states question. Oh, yeah. I love all the states equally. You're not going to do that. You got to pick one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Here we go. A, Grant's superior generalship. B, John Pemberton was a bumbling fool. C, a medical catastrophe is what doomed the Confederate defense of Vicksburg. A, B, and C, or yeah,
definitely. I mean, not that the first two are not true, but it really turns into a medical catastrophe. And by the time Grant is at the siege, essentially what he is doing is he's playing a giant game of chicken, and I need to keep my army healthy enough to outlast the health of the other army. And as soon as that army collapses, and that's ultimately what does. A few days before Pemberton surrenders, he sends a missive out to all of his commanding officers. He's considering one assault to try to fight their way out of the city. And he says, "Can your men do this?" And all of them report they can barely stand. I think one man says, "We might make it out, but they won't make it a mile." So their bodies just physically give out underneath the conditions
of the siege itself.
Of the siege itself, yeah.
And so throughout the campaign, now going back to the Union Army, you've already made the point that health of the Army seemed to improve over time, and you've already acknowledged that part of that was due to the soldiers' self-care. We've talked about Katie Shively's book, Nature's Civil War, another UNC book And I was turning around looking for it. It's on my shelf here someplace, and I'll show it in just a moment. Which I think your book certainly reaffirms that. But I'm still trying to get a handle on something that gets beyond the caring of the physical body, that a soldier understood in a way that his officers in the medical establishment could not quite grasp. I think that point's well established. I think you make it very well. But what I'm still grappling with is, why isn't anyone thinking about the mental and emotional trauma, not just again of combat, but of sustained operations in the field? Or maybe you have found some evidence in which doctors and soldiers are starting to come to terms with, or at least recognize, that there's a emotional and mental toll that life in the field and combat that it takes or inflicts. Do you see anything like that? Or are they blind to this, right? Are they blind to it?
I haven't seen anything where they're talking about those things explicitly. I do have soldiers who will talk, the ones who were in that winter camp trying to dig that canal, right? And then go through the campaign. Many of them will say, this was so much better than that. We're so much happier. At least we're doing, so there is kind of a bit of a reflection of an emotional difference of these experiences, but connecting those things to the functionality, to their health, is nothing that's happening explicitly on the ground.
Right. I'm going to press you a little bit on this one here. All right. So what about, we talk about all the time in Civil War soldier studies, we talk about the morale, not just of the men, but of those on the home front. And that word morale and how historians have looked at it, it's been almost all encompassing. It's too capacious. It can mean very different things to the people we're ascribing to, and I'll be precise. A soldier who rides home and is reassuring his loved ones that his spirits are good. What does that mean? Does that mean that he's, has sort of a positive outlook about, his chances of surviving? Does it mean that he has an optimistic view of where the war's headed and its outcome, that it was come to a successful conclusion? So morale as a way to evaluate or judge how men are feeling is, again, it's very challenging, because we as historians have used morale to cover almost anything, right? So let's take morale off for a moment. And let's go to emotions, because a big part of physical health is emotional health. The men were very aware of that. So, and again, maybe this isn't something you've thought about, deeply, but here's your chance, right? And that is, so what about the emotional health of the men? Did they even write about that? Did they not think about it? Did the officers? What's your sort of general thoughts about this?
Yeah, it is something I probably need to spend a little bit more time thinking about. So as the historian reading everything, I detect moments where their emotional health improves, and they tend to tag to moments where the overall health of the Army is improving. But I'm not seeing anything saying that specifically and kind of drawing these connections, if that makes sense.
It does. They're not going to use the word, right, emotional health or emotional well. Right. They won't use that, but they do identify emotions. And it was something that I became more, I think, aware of. Again, in trying to break down what do we mean by morale, which is almost always attached to how soldiers see the progress of the war. And now, of course, their understanding of their place in the war did not hinge exclusively upon military events. And I'm not denying the importance, and how critical that is. But again, too often we think, oh, what's the morale of Grant's men? Well, it's based upon, how close they think they're getting to the fall of Vicksburg. And certainly that weighed heavily on them. But they did use words, and I think cheerfulness is one of those words.
Yeah.
You'll see time and time again, and their desire and determination to manage those emotions that's very much connected to their physical health. And Jim Broomall, in his book, Private Confederacy, I think it does a nice job with the emotional issues that soldiers confront. So
I have a few questions here from the comment section, because I love to bring the voice of the people into our comments, our questions. So Michelle Donarski, what about the people in the town of Vicksburg? How was their health during the siege? Did they prefer the soldiers to be taken care, I guess what she means, before them for the efforts?
Yeah, so inside the siege, health deteriorates for everybody inside the town, but to different extents. So for civilians, of course, one of the things that begins to happen for civilians during the siege is they begin to dig those caves. So you have questions of issues of sanitation and air ventilation and things. But for civilians, most of what you kind of recorded is issues of malnutrition, starvation, scurvy, and then the health effects that kind of come after not having a lot of food to eat for long periods of time. They, of course, are fighting over access to clean water with soldiers. So they're competing for those resources with soldiers. They'll get very frustrated at the beginning of the siege before things get really bad, when they wake up and find like fruits and vegetables out of their vegetable garden have been raided over the night, and things like that. In terms of medical care, you really kind of have two different kind of distinctions. The soldiers have the physicians and the surgeons that are kind of taking care of them in the field, and then civilians kind of manage their own health amongst themselves. Of course, as more and more Confederate soldiers kind of begin to get sick, they spill over out of the trenches into various hospitals, and then they begin to just be housed. They're just housed in tents. They're housed in houses. One of the Union surgeons riding into the city after the fall of the siege makes the comment that he had never been in a hospital city before. And that's what it was. The entire city had kind of just become one giant hospital.
Lindsay's probably familiar with this. Mark Smith's, we've talked about Mark Smith's work before on the show. Smell of Battle, The Taste of the Siege. I think he has an excellent chapter on eating habits. Vicksburg civilians, I think it's really quite good, and how their inability as the siege progressed to get food that had a taste to it was more than just suffering, but it was a reminder to them that they were starting to lose their sense of being civilized people. And so this is again it's a book. It's a quick read, but it's an important read. And then before we get to another audience question, I just wanted to show. So I'm sorry why I left the camera here. Oh, I got terrible glare.
There you go.
Picture Civil War, again, a UNC book. Catherine Shively-Meyer, Keaton Shively. And that's a book, and it's one that I think is well worth people's time. John, I think we have some more questions here from the audience. No?
Yes, William Gormley. What was the availability of chloroform and under anesthesia at Vicksburg? Or how did that change?
Yeah, so it would have been prior to the siege, not being in siege conditions. Chloroform and anesthesia, or other anesthesia, ether, I think was the other big one, would have been very widely acceptable. One of the great myths, I think, of the war is that there was a huge shortage all the time of chloroform, and people regularly underwent surgery having to bite the bullet, so to speak. And the shortage was not quite as pervasive as I think it's always been kind of made out to seem. It certainly grows in the Confederacy over time. So there aren't any massive accounts of shortages in terms of anesthesia or chloroform, especially with the Union Army. They would have been very well supplied. By the time Grant reestablishes his supply line up at Milliken's Bend, they have easy access to bring in anything he needs. The Confederate Army, of course, as you move further into the siege, that's going to become more and more of a shortage. But the thing to remember kind of about Vicksburg is that the siege itself isn't necessarily a conflict of great traumatic injury. It's the disease that really deteriorates and erodes kind of the strength of the Army.
That's a great killer. I was just at Gabor Bort, my predecessor at CWI, noted Lincoln scholar. He lives, as the crow flies, probably 2.5 miles max due west of the Longstreet's attack on July 2nd. And on his farm, he has the wartime barn that housed the wounded from Sims's brigade, Georgia Brigade, and Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade. And there were, in fact, men buried all around his farm. But they found all kinds of relics, and this goes back to Lindsay, to your point, that the myth of soldiers biting on the bullet, which I helped advance, I fear, just this week on a different show I was doing. That there are bullets they found near this barn, right? And they got teeth marks in them. But the folks who just do a great job at the Medical Museum in Frederick. Lindsay, have you been there yet in Frederick, Maryland?
I went there when I was quite young, and I think it had just opened. And I've not had the privilege of making my way back yet. And I'm quite sad about that.
That's great. John's been interviewed by him before. They do nice stuff. But they make the point that those bullets that look like they have bite marks, that they're probably the teeth marks of pigs. Because as we all know, the pigs love to get into those, get into human flesh. So they're chewing on arms and legs and such, and they manage to get themselves on some bullets. So your point overall, I think, is well taken. The other just curious thing, and then we'll go to another question, is this farm is just it's beautiful. It's picturesque. It's fantastic. And again, it's so hard to imagine that it was crammed full of all these men with hideous wounds. But there was a separate room in the main house, in the kitchen, and it was the amputation room. And I thought, you know what? I bet when possible that is likely what happened on most Civil War field hospitals, because the thought of cutting off a man's arm or leg in plain sight of all these other men who are seriously wounded and trying to hold on to life. So I suspect there were a lot of amputation rooms. For example, I think even at the Spangler farm at Gettysburg, where they're not exactly sure where Lewis Armistead, where he was, basically kept. There's a number of outbuildings there. I can only imagine that the Federals also use those different buildings, one to sort of house patients and another to do these serious operations. John, you have some more questions for us, or is that it?
I actually have something that I would love for Lindsay to touch on before our time does run out, and that is we as Americans in popular history, we remember when Hurricane Katrina hit, we all learned what levees were. And I worked alongside the Corps of Engineers, and we talked about levees from time to time. And of course, there are levees in what you have written along the Mississippi River. I think it's a pretty interesting point that you make in there about how the levees changed as far as they became a graveyard, basically, for these men. And men would be walking down past the levees, and on the interior of the levees would be the burial places. And I think you said that one of the soldiers said it was the Golgotha of America. How, that's so fascinating, because we talk about, you have a class on memory. We talk about things involving death, the good death, and things of that nature. When you came across those points, knowing that, over 155 years, some of these levees have been, moved, redirected, etc. How did that affect your research when you found out that they're putting the men in the inside of the levees as well?
I mean, you have to think of how traumatic that would be and what you're referring to goes back to that January to April where they're trying to dig that canal and there's no dry ground except for the levees. It's the only thing above water. And they're just burying people wherever there's dry ground. And then as the area floods, they then have to move their camps onto the same levees that they're burying people in. Right. And just kind of that sense of no kind of nobility in this death, right? No nobility in this burial and this remembering. You're walking over the graves every day. It's getting muddy. It's slicking down. That I can't imagine what that feels like. And then to wake up one morning and not feel well yourself, right? And to know that could be your future, so many miles away from your family, in this graveyard. The benefit of the levees is most of those soldiers, everyone that they could find, are now buried in Vicksburg National Cemetery.
Oh, wow!
So when they go in 1860, it's 1867. When they go in, they want to build a cemetery in that area for Union soldiers. My understanding is the first effort or the first thought is to put it in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. And someone says, well, no, they died trying to get Vicksburg. Let's put it at Vicksburg. Mm-hmm. And so they go in and they dig out the levees and they get as many soldiers as they can. And I think there's somewhere around, if my public history memory reminds me right, I think there's 13,000 Civil War Union soldiers buried. But I always heard rumors. I haven't seen evidence, but I always heard rumors that for several years after their encampment there, that when it rained really hard and the levees washed out, if you happened to be standing near the river, you would every so often see bodies going down the river.
Yeah, these men really were living among the dead, right? I mean, it's truly overwhelming to think about that. And your point throughout your work about the water and the awareness of needing to get clean water, but the challenges and sometimes the impossibility of trying to get water that's just not truly putrid. Just again, that daily struggle, that daily grind, that I think you again, Lindsay, you make this case so well in your work that we're going to look at military campaigns, if we're going to understand the totality of that campaign, that we have to bring in all of its dimensions, and you bringing in this important dimension of the healthcare of these men and looking at within an environmental perspective. I mean, you're right there. I think where some of the best scholarship is coming out. So we're certainly very excited for you to work on your, what can I say, revisions? Is that the right word? Expansion? I don't know what you want to call it. But guess what? Lindsay, you have absolutely nothing that's going to compete with your time because you've seen every state in the union. There's nothing to do right now. Yeah. The rest of your life you can devote to stay home. You've done it all.
No need to go anywhere else.
But back to Indiana, I don't think you sufficiently appreciated the Hoosier State.
I should probably revisit.
You should revisit, and my mother, Charlotte Carmichael, will give you the tour of your life of Crown Hill Cemetery, filled with all kinds of Civil War historians, but also, you can't miss this one, the gravestone of, let's see, I bet John will know this, famous Hoosier buried in Indianapolis, not Civil War, a gangster. Oh.
All I can think of is Dillinger, but I can't.
You're right. You nailed it. That's what John Dillinger. He was a Hoosier. This goes without saying, he was a hell of a basketball player and baseball player as well.
Wow.
Well, basketball, it's just in our genes. We can't help that.
Yeah, Johnny Depp didn't do that part in the movie.
He did not, but another Johnny Depp-like actor, and you're going to just have to hit like the exit button, just because I'm going to keep talking about Indiana. Just watch our numbers go down. Right? James Dean is a famous Hoosier, so I think Johnny Depp is kind of the descendant of.
Well, Lindsay, you'll have to hit every province in Canada next because where I'm heading, so. You got to head that direction too. There's a Civil War vet in Canada.
Up there, yeah,
plenty up there as well.
But you don't have a gangster like John Dillinger up in Canada.
I'm sure I could find a couple. Someone's running something illegal up there. It'll happen.
Hey, Lindsay, thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. This was really fun.
Yeah. And our last show, Lindsay, or not for a while. We'll come back. We'll be back in August.
Yeah. Don't worry, everybody. We'll be back at some point later this year as we get settled in to figure out what's going on with our classes in general. All three of us are wondering what's going on and what the world is going to look like in academia in the fall. And we're all going to have probably 3 separate experiences in that regard. So we are hoping to be back on with you all here in the future, in the fall term, as we would say, and with a lot more things to talk about. We do want to also thank the UNC Press for their continued support of our live streams. I want to thank Kara for posting the Shauna Devine book from UNC Press. I pinned that if you guys want to get started on that. And then when Lindsay gets hers out, you can get hers and then compare and contrast the two of those. Some of you students can do a book review and get some extra credit. That'd be fantastic. But Lindsay, thank you so much for being on this evening and putting up with Pete and I. And it's been fantastic to have you on here.
Thank you.
And Lindsay, I'm going to take a moment here just to thank John, who was gracious enough for me to be the barnacle to his ship, so to speak. And we started this, gosh, it seems like a lifetime ago, but we started in March, did we not, John? And I
believe it was March, yeah.
Yeah, and we've probably done, what do you think, pushing 30 shows maybe?
Maybe. I'd have to look back and see what all we did, yeah.
They're all going to be on John's page, the Tattooed Historian, as well as the CWI YouTube page, so people can come and they can see it. But it's been such a pleasure because what I enjoy about working with John is he has a real commitment to reaching out and making history accessible. So many different groups of people. And on top of that, he's always trying to bring in different historians who often don't get a platform. In fact, Lindsay, we should have mentioned this to you earlier. Just last Saturday, he devoted an entire day to, in essence, was a conference for students whose, of course, their semester got cut short. And so John was gracious and thoughtful enough to give them that opportunity to be able to share their work with the general audience. And as we all know, Lindsay, there's a lot of academics who are really good people, but their idea of what we do is that we do scholarship and then it trickles down. That's not how it works. I think that's sort of mildly elitist. I think John's a good example. And stuff didn't just trickle down from the academy, right? It also comes from community historians, activists, local historians like John. They come together, and I think John embodies that. So, John, thank you so much. And if we don't have a show before you head off to Canada, I mean, I know you and I'll see each other. John and I will. But best of luck, John, in graduate school, as Lindsay can attest to. It's an exciting time.
Yeah.
It can be a trying time as well, but it's all good.
No, thank you for all that, Pete. That really means a lot. And I know that once I get up there, whenever that is, and I get settled and I get my internet back up and running, I'm sure we'll be doing something together because I would love to have office hours, but you just never know now what's going to be happening. So I'm sure we'll be able to put time together to keep doing this because it is all about accessibility and about having a welcoming environment for historians and history lovers of all kinds to come in and be affected by history in a great way. And that's what I've tried to do. That's what I keep trying to do. And I know there are others who are doing it, and I'm very happy to see others lending their voices to trying to make this whole thing more accessible. And I want to also, Lindsay's like, I feel like a third wheel here, but I also want to thank you, Pete, for always, believing in the brand. You were the one who met me in the coffee shop, and the rest is absolute history. Where we covered the CWI summer conference last year, and hopefully, God willing, we'll be doing it next year.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'll be having some good times in the future with the live stream. So I really appreciate you believing in it and enjoying it as well, getting you on here to face technology head on.
We're gonna get Lindsay to CWI, and
Yeah.
we're going to see if she can make the transition from what some might say is sort of the second theater, which would be the West, of course. If she can make the transition to the big leagues, and we'll get her to do a battlefield tour at Gettysburg. What do you think about that, Lindsay?
That could be really fun.
There you go.
We'll allow you to make 2 references to the West when you're out here, because when you're in Adams County, there's Gettysburg and nothing else.
Turning point of the war. Forget Vicksburg.
That's right.
So
take good care of yourselves. Our audiences too. Stay healthy, man. Stay healthy. Wear your mask. Social distance, man. Don't be silly about this stuff.
Yes. Yeah. Just like the Union Army, listen to the medical professionals. So thank you all so much for tuning in every single week to each episode, or thank you for tuning into this one. If this was your first, we really appreciate it. Thank you for the comments, the questions. Please don't forget to go support UNC Press. They've been a great partner in crime with us. And we can't wait to be back on with you here in the future to talk more Civil War history. So thanks, everybody. Take care and be safe.
Bye.
Bye.